Have you ever heard of the Queen who was born a princess, but didn't have a castle or a throne waiting for her? Well, that's right. Our story begins with a girl named Mary, who was born on May 26, 1867, at a time when carriages still cruised the streets of London and Queen Victoria reigned supreme. But first, take the opportunity to like, comment on what you think of this real story, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters in the life of one of the most remarkable women of the British monarchy. Mary of Teck came into the world as a princess, but not the kind we imagine, surrounded by riches and banquets every day. Her father Francis was the Duke of Teck, a noble title, yes, but with little power and almost no money. Her mother, Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, was a granddaughter of King George III, which gave Mary royal blood on her mother's side, connecting her directly to British royalty. Even so, the family struggled financially. They lived on the property of royal relatives and were always looking for a way to maintain the dignity of their title. In practice, Maria was a princess without a palace of her own, and grew up understanding from an early age what it was like to live between two worlds, that of nobility and that of reality. The royal family looked at them with a certain distance. After all, they were noble, yes, but too poor for the standards of the court. But make no mistake, this childhood without many luxuries shaped Mary in a special way. She grew up reserved, disciplined, observant, characteristics that would make her one of the most stable and steady figures of the British royal family during the most turbulent times of the 20th century. And it was precisely because of this royal blood, even if somewhat distant, that Mary's destiny took an unexpected turn. A marriage proposal coming straight from the heart of British royalty would change her life forever, and also the course of the English monarchy. But then comes the question, what happens when a young princess, raised far from the center of power, receives a marriage proposal from the direct heir to the British throne? Teck's story took a surprising turn when she was chosen to marry Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, Queen Victoria's grandson and first in line to the British throne, no less. It was a huge step for someone who came from an impoverished nobility. The engagement took place in December 1891, and the royal family welcomed the match. Mary was serious, educated, refined, and discreet, everything expected of a future queen. But fate was cruel. Just 6 weeks after the engagement, Albert Victor died suddenly of pneumonia at the age of 28. The tragedy deeply shook the royal family, and also Mary, who was left not only in mourning, but also in an uncertain position. She had been chosen to be queen. What now? Surprisingly, the answer came from within the royal family itself. Queen Victoria was so fond of Mary that she suggested that she marry Albert's younger brother, Prince George, Duke of York, the future King George V. The proposal was delicate, but it made political and social sense. Mary and George began seeing each other, and their relationship blossomed into respect and affection. They became engaged in May 1893 and married in July of the same year. This union would be one of the most enduring and solid in the British monarchy, and Mary would go on to play a central role as consort, not only as the king's wife, but also as a firm advisor and constant presence behind the scenes of power. The marriage of Mary of Teck to Prince George, Duke of York, took place on 6 July 1893 at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. It was a grand affair, as was to be expected of a royal union, but it was also fraught with political and personal significance. George was not the original heir to the throne. That position had been held by his elder brother Albert Victor, who had died shortly before. Mary was betrothed to George at the suggestion of Queen Victoria, who deeply admired her for her composure, intelligence, and sense of duty. At first, George was reserved and introspective, and Mary, still reeling from the loss of her previous fiancé, was also quite serious. But over time, the two developed a solid partnership based on mutual respect. They shared similar values. Both were devoted to the crown, their family, and the stability of the monarchical institution. The marriage was, by royal standards, remarkably happy. Mary accompanied George on nearly all his public engagements and diplomatic trips. They lived relatively simply for a royal, especially early in their married life, when they lived at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate. There, they led an almost bourgeois routine, without great luxuries, but full of rules, punctuality, and discipline, exactly as Mary preferred. The couple had 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl. Among them, 2 would play a decisive role in British history: Edward VIII, who would later abdicate the throne for love, and George VI, who would assume the throne during World War II and become the father of Queen Elizabeth II. Motherhood, however, was not the warmest point of Mary's personality. She was a strict, formal mother and kept a certain emotional distance from her children, following the Victorian customs of the time, which believed that too much affection softened the character. Even so, Mary was a present wife and a loyal consort. She was trained to represent the crown, and she did it perfectly. Her posture was impeccable, her speech was controlled, and her appearance was always calculated. Mary understood that, in the game of monarchy, image was almost as important as politics. But this tranquility in her marriage and public life was about to be tested. In 1910, after the death of King Edward VII, Prince George ascended the throne as George V, and Mary went from Duchess to Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. It was the beginning of a new era, both for the empire and for her. When Mary of Teck became Queen Consort on May 6, 1910, with the coronation of her husband as King George V, she knew she was not just changing her title, she was taking on a role that would require her to have poise, strength, and an almost superhuman ability to keep up appearances in turbulent times. The British monarchy was entering a new and unstable century, and Mary would be the female face of that transition. The beginning of his reign coincided with an era of internal and external political tensions. The United Kingdom was experiencing a constitutional crisis involving the power of the House of Lords, while Europe was seething with the rise of nationalist ideologies and military rivalries that would soon culminate in the First World War. As Queen Consort, Mary had no direct political power, but her influence was felt behind the scenes and in the way she helped shape the image of the crown. She believed passionately in the dignity of the monarchy as a symbol of stability and continuity. This meant that her public demeanor was always impeccable. She never overreacted, never allowed herself to appear fragile or disoriented, even in the midst of chaos. During the First World War, this steadfastness became an anchor for the British people. As the country watched thousands of its sons march to the front, Mary devoted herself to visiting military hospitals, comforting grieving families, supporting fundraising campaigns, and showing that the monarchy was with the people. Her presence was sober but comforting. Even so, she and the king faced some very difficult challenges. Germany, the main enemy in the war, was also the birthplace of many members of the royal family, including Mary, who had German blood on her father's side. The family's Germanic origins led to severe criticism of the British monarchy, which was considered foreign by part of the public. This presented George V and Mary with a historic decision to publicly break with the past and rename the dynasty. It was in this climate that the House of Windsor was born in 1917, replacing the family's old name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which was clearly Germanic. Mary supported the change, understanding that preserving the crown was more important than preserving family names. This gesture, although symbolic, helped restore the population's confidence in the monarchy. Maria's stance during the war was marked by restraint, but also by presence. She knew that often, it was not necessary to speak, it was enough to be there, and being there with firmness and constancy was what she did best. But as the world settled into a new order after the war, personal challenges within the palace began to mount. Being Queen Consort was one thing, being the mother of a future king was quite another, far more complex one, and Mary would have to deal with heirs who did not easily conform to her rigid expectations. Teck's position within the monarchy was put to the test in an extremely delicate way. Her father, Duke Francis of Teck, belonged to a German noble house, and although Mary was born and raised in London, German blood ran in her veins, and this would become a serious problem in wartime. Anti-German sentiment among the British reached a fever pitch. The streets were filled with protests, businesses with Germanic names were attacked, and even members of the aristocracy with German surnames were subject to social persecution. The public wanted to distance themselves from anything that had to do with Germany, and that included, unfortunately, even the royal family itself. Newspapers began to make insinuations, pamphlets circulated spreading doubts. How could one trust a monarchy with German roots? While thousands of British soldiers were dying facing the troops of Kaiser William II, who, ironically, was a first cousin of King George V. The climate was one of distrust, and the winds of public opinion threatened the stability of the crown. It was at this point that George V and Mary made one of the most symbolic and strategic decisions in the modern history of the British monarchy, to abandon the name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and create the Windsor dynasty. The new name was inspired by Windsor Castle, a fortress associated with English royalty for centuries. It was a masterstroke in public relations and a clear attempt to reaffirm the royal family's patriotism. Mary, despite the personal impact the decision had on her, was completely supportive of the plan. She knew that protecting the image of the monarchy was more important than preserving a family name. This attitude showed how willing she was to put duty above family pride. She was no longer Mary of Teck, she was Queen Mary of Great Britain, and that needed to be made clear to the people. Internally, however, tensions existed. Renouncing her past was like erasing a part of her identity. But Mary never showed weakness in public. To the nation, she was the resilient queen who spoke perfect English, dressed soberly, and represented the ideal of British steadfastness. Her adaptability and emotional control helped restore the public's trust in the crown. But the conflicts, although controlled in the public arena, left their mark on the private sphere. Her relationship with her children, especially her heir, began to become more difficult. She demanded from them the same rigidity and posture that she imposed on herself, but not everyone was willing or prepared to follow her example. And it is at this point that we enter a new challenge in Maria's trajectory. How did she become a reference of national strength during the war, keeping her image intact even in the face of widespread suffering? During the First World War, the figure of Queen Mary of Teck took on a new dimension in the British imagination. Whereas she had previously been seen as a reserved and traditional consort, the war transformed her image into something much greater, a symbol of strength, stability, and silent sacrifice. At a time of irreparable loss, bombings on British soil, and soldiers being sent en masse to the battlefields of Europe, the Queen's presence was like a pillar that could not be shaken, and she made sure to show that she was with the people, not just in words but in actions. Mary began to visit military hospitals regularly. She would enter the wards, often filled with the seriously wounded, and talk to the soldiers. She asked their names, their stories, their pain. She never cried in public, even when she saw young men maimed by the war. She believed that her role was to maintain the dignity of the monarchy as a mirror for the nation. If the Queen endured in silence, the people would too. In addition, she organized fundraising campaigns for the Red Cross, participated in charity events, and encouraged the domestic production of clothing, food, and other supplies for the troops. She was also involved in founding and supporting institutions that cared for war widows and orphans. All of this was done with extreme discretion, without seeking applause or recognition. Maria saw it as simply her duty. Another aspect that marked her stance was the way she lived during the conflict. Unlike many members of the aristocracy who lived in isolation in luxury, Maria chose a more measured life. She cut back on court expenses, reduced banquets, left her jewels in the safe, and opted for simpler clothing. It was a symbolic but powerful gesture. If the people suffered, she also showed sacrifice. This behavior earned her respect, even among her critics. The press, which had previously questioned her German origins, began to exalt her as a stoic queen, tireless and loyal to the country she had chosen as her own. She became what the people needed to see in dark times: a firm face, a serene posture, a rock in the middle of the storm. But while she appeared strong in public, conflicts within the palace itself only grew. Her children, especially the older ones, began to show rebellion, distance themselves, and even contempt for their mother's strictness. Maria, who was almost unbreakable to the people, found it difficult to deal with the emotions of motherhood, and this would have profound consequences that would shape the destiny of the monarchy itself. If Mary of Teck was the queen of composure in front of the people, at home she was the mother of discipline and emotional distance. Raised in a rigid environment where duty spoke louder than affection, Mary simply repeated with her children the formula she believed to be the safest: control, obedience, and hierarchy. The problem is that not all of her children were prepared to live under this regime of emotional ice. Mary had 6 children with George V, but her relationship with them, especially the 2 eldest, Edward, the future Edward VIII, and George, the future George VI, was marked by excessive formality and little intimacy. She addressed them by title, maintained a certain coldness in conversation, and showed little physical affection or words of affection. Kisses, hugs, or compliments were simply not part of the maternal routine at Buckingham Palace. Edward, the eldest son, was a charming, sensitive, and extremely charismatic young man. Everything that Maria superficially admired but deeply feared. He was also impulsive, emotional, and sought pleasure and freedom, which went against all the values that Maria held most dear: control, reserve, and sacrifice. Her mother viewed Edward with growing distrust, and he responded with frustration and rebellion. Their relationship gradually grew distant, creating an emotional rift that would never heal. The second son, George, more introverted, anxious, and a stutterer since childhood, was closer to the model idealized by Maria: obedient, shy, hard-working. But even he suffered under the weight of his mother's demands. Maria showed no empathy for his emotional difficulties and saw his stutter as an obstacle that had to be overcome with willpower. Acceptance was not part of the Queen's playbook. She firmly believed that suffering shaped character. This harshness was not malice. It was a reflection of the times and of Mary's own history. She had been raised to serve the crown, not to be swayed by sentiment. But the result was a generation of royal children who grew up fearful or resentful. Many historians believe that the way Mary treated her sons, especially Edward, played a direct role in the dramatic course the succession would take in later years. The Queen Mother never gave in to the fads of affection. She believed that love was about educating people to duty, dignity, and silence. But in a world that was changing with radio, cinema, and an increasingly emotional society, such rigidity would come at a very high cost. And this cost would begin to reveal itself in a tragic way when Mary's heir, already king, decides to give up everything for the love of a divorced American woman. In 1936, when King George V died, his eldest son ascended the throne as Edward VIII. To the world, it was the beginning of a new reign. For Mary of Teck, it was the beginning of an emotional nightmare, the collapse of everything she had taught, stood for, and represented. Edward was the opposite of the image Mary had expected of a king. He loved the limelight, disdained protocol, and most worryingly, he was in love with Wallis Simpson, an American who had been divorced twice. For the Church of England, of which the British monarch is also the supreme head, this was unthinkable. For the British government, it was politically risky, and for Mary, it was a personal betrayal of George V's legacy, the throne, and the very concept of royalty. Mary could not accept that her son was willing to give up the throne for a romance. She saw this gesture not as a courageous choice, but as an act of weakness and selfishness. In her view, being king was a sacred, non-negotiable duty above any personal desires. The world might be changing, but for Mary, some things were absolute, and the throne was one of them. In December 1936, less than a year after George V's death, Edward VIII abdicated the throne so he could marry Wallis Simpson. He gave an emotional radio address, saying he could not continue as king without the woman he loves. The gesture moved many, but not Mary. The Queen Mother was devastated. She did not attend her son's wedding. She never called Wallis Simpson Duchess, even after she was given the title. And most shockingly, she never fully forgave Edward, even years later, even as time eased the pain. For Mary, he had broken the most sacred bond between the sovereign and the British people. In the silence of the palace, Maria saw not only her son's reign crumble, but also the image she had fought her entire life to build, that of a monarchy based on duty, not emotion. The abolition of the throne for love was, for her, an almost absurd idea. But amidst the mourning and public shame, a new challenge arose. With Edward's abdication, the person who would take the throne was his second son, the insecure and shy George, who had never prepared himself to be king. And so once again, Mary of Teck had to stand firm and put the crown before her heart. When Edward VIII abdicated, the throne did not remain vacant. It passed immediately to his younger brother, Albert Frederick Arthur George, Mary's second son, known privately as Bertie. He would take over as George VI, and it was at this point that Mary of Teck, though shaken by her eldest son's abdication, turned the tide emotionally and focused all her energy on the new king. And he desperately needed support. George VI, he was not meant to be king. He had always lived in the shadow of his brother, with a shy personality, a debilitating stutter, and a deep fear of the public stage. The pressure of the crown could crush him, and Mary knew it. As tough as she was, she understood the weight of the burden her son was about to bear. The British monarchy had been wounded by scandal, and now it needed dignity, stability, and moral strength. And all of this fell on a man who could barely make a public speech. Maria then did what she did best: stabilize, organize, and protect the image of the monarchy. She remained close to her son, guiding his conduct, helping with symbolic decisions, and more than ever, ensuring that the public saw the new king as a dignified man, even if not charismatic. She was present behind the scenes at every official moment, ensuring that the new generation of the crown restored the lost trust. More than that, she refused to assume the title of Queen Mother. She did not want to appear as a sentimental or decorative figurehead. She preferred to continue to be called Queen Mary, a gesture that, on the one hand, reflected her haughtiness, but also her intention to maintain the symbolic presence of authority and continuity of the dynasty. George VI deeply respected his mother, but he also felt the constant weight of expectation. Mary supported him firmly, but with the same demanding gaze as always. There was no patting on the back. There was guidance, strategy, and silences full of meaning. And despite everything, it worked. Little by little, George VI grew on the throne, and Mary was a key player in strengthening it. She also became close to the new queen consort, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, wife of George VI and mother of the little Princess Elizabeth. Mary saw Elizabeth as an ideal ally, level-headed, dedicated, and popularly charismatic. Here was the new face of the British monarchy, and Mary would do everything she could to ensure that she and the next generation knew how to wear the crown without a blemish. As the winds of World War II began to blow, Mary knew the monarchy would face yet another brutal test, and she, even without a crown, would continue to be the hidden foundation behind the throne. If as a mother Mary of Teck was known for her strictness and aloofness, as a grandmother she was something a little different, still stern, still formal, but with a guiding rather than oppressive presence. And this played a fundamental role in the formation of the young Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, Mary's granddaughter, who would later become none other than Queen Elizabeth II. Mary knew Elizabeth from an early age. The girl was the daughter of George VI Albert, Mary's second son, and from an early age she demonstrated a naturally reserved, observant, and disciplined demeanor, characteristics that charmed Mary. Unlike other members of the family, Elizabeth did not need to be corrected all the time. She learned by watching, imitating, absorbing, and who did she observe most? Her grandmother. Mary was not the kind of grandmother who played on the floor or told children stories. She was the lady with the watchful eyes, firm voice, and imposing presence, who taught lessons in royal conduct with short sentences and controlled gestures. Elizabeth, even as a child, understood that there was something special about this woman. She was not just her grandmother, she was the living embodiment of British royalty. The future queen saw Mary as an almost mythological figure. She learned from her how to walk with an upright posture, how to keep a calm gaze even under pressure, and most importantly, how to put duty above emotion. Mary, in turn, saw something rare in her granddaughter, a successor who could, in fact, keep the monarchy alive in a century of constant change. Even in small gestures, Mary prepared Elizabeth. Her presence at formal dinners, the details of her attire, her diplomatic greetings, everything was observed and commented on. Mary taught, not as a teacher, but as a living institution. And Elizabeth learned, not as a student, but as someone who understood that her destiny was already set. During the abdication of her uncle Edward VIII and the subsequent coronation of her father, Elizabeth was directly impacted, and Mary was one of the few royal figures who managed to remain calm in the eye of the storm. Her stance in the face of the crisis served as a silent lesson to her granddaughter. The monarchy could collapse if emotions took the place of duty. Later, when Elizabeth began to fulfill official duties, still as a princess, Mary accompanied her from afar, but always vigilant. It was as if she were saying, without words, "Watch, learn, you will be the future, and the future needs roots." This coexistence left deep scars. Elizabeth would take into her life and to the throne many of the lessons she inherited from Mary. Composure, reserve, a sense of mission, political neutrality, and a focus on the institutional continuity of the monarchy. And all of this was strengthened because Maria maintained not only an impeccable posture, but also a public image that was planned and controlled down to the smallest detail. Mary of Teck wasn't just a queen. She was the very mold of what the public expected when they thought of royalty. And this was no accident. She crafted this image over decades with an almost obsessive attention to detail, creating a public persona that conveyed strength, stability, and tradition, the three pillars that for her supported the monarchy. From a young age, Maria understood the power of image. She knew that royalty could not be seen as common people. On the contrary, they needed to appear almost above humanity, as if they were a living continuation of history. For this reason, her appearance was always meticulously planned. Formal dresses even at home, erect posture, perfectly tied hair, and of course jewelry. But not just any jewelry. Pieces that carried history and symbolism, used to communicate power, continuity, and solemnity. For example, she refused to wear clothes with bright colors or overly modern details. She preferred sober tones, classic embroidery, and silhouettes that evoked previous generations of the monarchy. For her, every button, every brooch, and every fabric told a story, and she used those stories as a shield. In public, Mary never showed her emotions. She never cried, never showed anger or excitement. Her face was always serene, her body language restrained. She believed that the queen should not feel like others, but rather represent the stability that others sought. To many, this made her seem cold. To her, it was the only way to ensure that the monarchy would survive the difficult times. The press, even in the early years of the 20th century, was already beginning to influence public opinion, and Maria knew this. She carefully monitored how she was portrayed and took care with every official appearance, every photograph, every ceremony. Nothing was by chance. She understood, long before it was common to talk about it, that the monarchy was also an image was power. Interestingly, even in official portraits, Mary maintained a neutral expression and a steady gaze. She did not want to appear sympathetic, she wanted to appear unshakable, and that is exactly how the British people came to see her, as a jeweled rock, a living symbol of the old order, unyielding to the chaos of the outside world. This concern for her image had a profound impact on the perception of the monarchy during times of crisis. Through wars, scandals, and social changes, Mary remained exactly the same, and this conveyed security. She was the one piece that didn't change when everything else seemed to fall apart. But this passion for representing royalty also expressed itself in an almost peculiar way, her obsession with royal jewels and antiques. She did not see these items as mere accessories. For Maria, they were sacred relics of the institution. Teck's eyes sparkle. Subtly, of course. It was the jewels and historical relics of the monarchy. But it wasn't just about vanity. For Mary, every tiara, every necklace, every antique object carried a symbolic and institutional function. They were extensions of the throne, fragments of history that represented not only the power of the crown, but its continuity over the centuries. She treated these items almost as if they were part of a sacred mission, to preserve and protect the British royal heritage, and more than that, to restore it. Mary became famous for her ability to recover pieces that had been dispersed by previous generations. It was not uncommon for her to spot an antique piece of jewelry or furniture on a visit to an aristocratic relative and politely say, "I believe this rightfully belongs in the royal collection." Of course, this habit, something between diplomacy and insistence, led to jokes among the nobility. Some even said that Mary could walk into a guest house and come out with a candelabra in her pocket, but no one denied its effectiveness. Over the years, she gathered and organized much of the royal collection that is now preserved in palaces such as Buckingham and Windsor. Her obsession with jewelry was equally meticulous. She studied the origins of each piece, rearranged sets, had crowns restored, transformed ancient necklaces into contemporary brooches, all with the aim of maintaining the grandeur and coherence of the royal image. And whenever possible, she wore them in public as silent messages of dynastic power. For example, when she appeared wearing a tiara that had belonged to Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, she was not just adorning her head, she was invoking a lineage, asserting her legitimacy as a pillar of the monarchy. But there was also an emotional side to this collection. For Mary, surrounding herself with these objects was a way of keeping alive the ghosts of the past that she so revered. Queen Victoria, George V, centuries of imperial history. It was her way of never feeling alone, of always being accompanied by the symbols of that which she believed she protected above all else, the crown. This love of all things traditional was also reflected in her refusal to modernize certain protocols. And even after she was widowed and her son was on the throne, Mary refused to assume the title of Queen Mother. After George V's death in 1936, Mary of Teck was no longer officially Queen Consort. Her son, George VI, was now the new king, and protocol dictated that she should assume the title Queen Mother, as other dowager queens would do in similar situations. But with Mary, things were never quite so simple. She categorically refused this title. For her, being called Queen Mother sounded almost like an emotional retirement, as if she were relegated to the background of the monarchy, in the shadow of the new sovereign. And Mary was not a shadow. She was, in the eyes of history itself, a cornerstone of the modern monarchy. Instead, she continued to be known simply as Queen Mary. Simple as that, no modifications, no adjectives, no concessions. It said a lot about who she was, someone who believed that her role as queen had not ended with her husband's death, because for her, the title was not just conjugal, it was institutional, lifelong, and loaded with symbolic responsibility. She also did not want to be mistaken for a popular matriarchal figure. The term Queen Mother could evoke tenderness and emotional closeness, two things Mary never wanted to represent. She preferred to remain dignified, distant, imposing, maintaining the same level of solemnity that she had maintained throughout the reign of George V. There was also a practical logic to her decision. There were now two Queen Elizabeths in the palace, the wife of George VI and the king's daughter, the future Elizabeth II. Mary did not want there to be any further confusion of titles in the public mind or in official diplomacy. Thus, by maintaining herself as Queen Mary, she reasserted not only her identity, but also her unique position within the structure of the monarchy. This refusal to reinvent herself was not empty pride. It was consistent with everything she had been throughout her life, a woman who placed the institution above individuality. She was not the king's mother. She was, and always would be, Queen of England, even if she was a widow. Her role, her legacy, her image remained intact. And so it was until the end. In public engagements, in official appearances, in historical records, Mary remained firm in the title and role she had carved out for herself. She never saw herself as someone from the past. She still considered herself a living part of the crown. And this permanence was reflected not only in her titles, but also in her longevity. A woman who would live long enough to see 3 reigns, 2 world wars, and a total transformation of the world. Mary of Teck lived to be 85, a remarkable feat for her time, and even more so for someone who spent her life under the weight of royal responsibilities and political pressures. Her long life was marked by gigantic transformations on the world stage and within the British monarchy itself. She didn't just follow history, she helped shape it. During her lifetime, Mary saw 3 kings occupy the throne: her husband George V, her son Edward VIII, albeit briefly, and then George VI. She also lived long enough to see her granddaughter Elizabeth grow up, graduate as crown princess, and prepare for the role that would soon transform the world, becoming queen. During this time, even after leaving the post of consort, Mary never withdrew from public life. She continued to attend official events, make diplomatic appearances, visit charities, and keep the image of the monarchy alive in the hearts of the British people. She was the link between the Victorian 19th century and the modern 20th century, a living bridge between imperial austerity and royal modernity. And this symbolic role was deeply respected. The press, politicians, and even the people saw Mary as an almost untouchable figure. Even those who criticized her coldness or rigidity recognized that she was the embodiment of royal duty, an example of constancy in uncertain times. She survived 2 world wars, an abdication scandal, and the collapse of empires, and maintained her poise throughout. Mary died on 24 March 1953, just 10 weeks before the coronation of her granddaughter, Elizabeth II. It was as if the circle had come full circle. She saw the next generation being prepared. She saw the institution she had dedicated her life to, protecting, being passed on, and with that, her mission was accomplished. Her death was met with national mourning. The United Kingdom came to a standstill to pay tribute to the woman who, for decades, had been the most stable face of royalty. Her presence was so solid that many could hardly imagine Buckingham Palace without her. But although she is gone, Mary has left a deep and lasting mark on the way the British monarchy functions to this day, a mark made of tradition, formality, and, above all, unbreakable duty. Teck's true legacy lies not just in the official portraits that hang in the royal galleries, nor in the glittering jewels she so carefully guarded, nor even in the salons she strode through with her impeccable poise. It lies in the way she helped define what it means to be part of the British monarchy. Mary embodied the belief that the throne is not about who you are, it's about what you stand for. For her, being a member of the royal family was neither a choice nor a privilege, it was a lifelong mission. She believed that kings and queens should embody stability, order, and dignity, regardless of personal pain, family tragedy, or changes in the world. Her greatest legacy was to build a monarchy centered on duty and continuity, even in times of profound change. She was the silent heart of the transition from Victorian ceremonial royalty to modern constitutional monarchy. While others wavered, including her son Edward VIII, Mary stood firm. She did not change with the world, but she made the world respect what she stood for. Her influence was direct on 2 kings and a future queen. She molded George VI with exactingness and discipline, and left Elizabeth II a legacy of composure, public service, and emotional reserve, which the monarch would carry with her until the end of her own life. It is no wonder that Elizabeth II, now mature, always spoke of her grandmother with silent reverence, not so much out of affection but out of deep admiration. Mary's style may seem rigid or outdated to modern eyes, but it is impossible to deny that it was this rigidity that sustained the monarchy during the greatest crises of the 20th century: abdication, World War, the rise of republics, the fall of empires, and the British monarchy remained. And much of this is due to the model that Mary defended with every gesture and every silence. She taught royalty that being a monarch is not about pleasing, it is about enduring. That the throne is not made of gold, but of constancy. And this teaching echoes to this day. Whenever we see a royal ceremony, a line of succession, a crown being passed down, in every moment of formality and duty, there is an invisible piece of Mary of Teck holding it all together. Did you like this story? Comment, like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any royal stories.